Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the third Partners webinar for the 2023 Spring Hydrologic Outlook. My name is Joe Smolka. I'm a hydrologist here at the National Water Center, and I'll be going through a general overview for the Spring Hydrologic Outlook for the Greater Mississippi Basin, Souris River, Red River of the North, and Great Lakes Basins. We will also hear from representatives from each of the 5 river forecast centers for more detailed information on the flood potential for their respective regions. And just as a reminder, we do have a feedback form linked on the feedback tab over here on the right on the story map. So please fill that out if you have time after the webinar. We'd love to hear everyone's thoughts on the changes to the presentation this year. So the email reminder you received a bit ago has a link to the PDF copy of the story map, if this is easier for you to follow along with. This webinar is being recorded, and a follow-up email will be sent with key message information, link to the story map with the PDF copy, the feedback form, and a recording of the webinar. So this will likely be sent out by close of business today, but at the latest will be sent out first thing tomorrow morning. And should you have any questions during the presentation, please go ahead and type it into the question box in the GoToWebinar GUI, and we will address it at the conclusion of the presentations. All right, so let's get started here. So we'll start by taking a look at the past 2 weeks of accumulated precipitation percent of mean to see how things have changed since the last webinar. And generally speaking, conditions have been fairly wet across much of the greater Mississippi River Basin over the past 2 weeks, especially across portions of the upper and middle Mississippi Basin, the Ohio River Basin, and the Great Lakes region. In the upper Mississippi Basin through the Great Lakes region and then over into Ohio, we've seen generally speaking, 175 to 300% of mean precipitation, and that's shown in those darker green colors and the lighter blue colors, which has continued to keep things moist across that region and has increased the flood threat across portions of the upper Mississippi River Basin. Then down into the mid-Mississippi Basin and the far lower portions of the Arkansas Red Basin, there's been about 150 to 300% of mean precipitation over the past 2 weeks, which has moistened things up quite a bit down in Arkansas. And we'll see more of this in the next few graphics. And then up in the Souris River Basin in North Dakota, conditions have been very dry over the past 2 weeks. So all of this said, the main takeaway really with respect to changes from the previous webinar is that conditions across the upper Mississippi Basin have continued to be wet, and the threat for spring flooding has increased. So we can tie this precipitation into our soil conditions across the basin and take a look at the Climate Prediction Center soil moisture ranking percentiles. And the biggest change in the soil moisture conditions over the past 2 weeks is across Arkansas and southern Missouri, where soils have moistened up in response to that above normal rainfall that we showed in the previous graphic. And they're now in the 95th to 99th percentiles. The soil moisture content has also increased across portions of the upper Mississippi River Basin and Great Lakes region due to recent precipitation across those basins. And then elsewhere, there's been minimal changes over the past 2 weeks with overall dry soil moisture conditions for the upper Arkansas Red and middle Missouri basins continuing. And then the soils within the Souris River Basin are near normal to slightly dry, which is a slight decrease in moisture content from 2 weeks ago. So considering the recent precipitation and soil moisture conditions, let's take a look at how this has impacted the USGS stream flows compared to historical flows for all days of the year. And the main story we see here is that over the past 2 weeks, stream flows have increased to above normal to even much above normal across portions of the upper Mississippi River Basin, the Great Lakes region, the lower Ohio River Basin, down through the middle Mississippi Basin, and then across far lower reaches of the Arkansas Red Basin, which has increased the vulnerability to additional rainfall in the coming weeks for some areas. And elsewhere across the greater Mississippi Basin, we are seeing near normal to below normal stream flows, potentially mitigating widespread significant flooding impacts. And then we did want to point out that across the northern tier, you don't see those basins highlighted. They're just showing blank white basins, and that's due to the seasonal gauges not taking measurements or being turned off, as many of them are iced in. Moving on to drought conditions, now looking at the U.S. Drought Monitor. So here is the latest drought monitor released March 9th. And then we can compare that to 2 weeks ago, shown here, which was released February 23rd. And as I swipe back and forth, you can see that there hasn't really been any notable change to the drought conditions over the past 2 weeks, with virtually no drought along and east of the Mississippi River mainstem, and then the extreme drought conditions continuing across portions of the Missouri Basin and upper Arkansas Red Basin. Now looking at the current snow water equivalent across the basin, there is snow cover across much of the upper Mississippi and upper Missouri basins, with generally above normal total water content in the snowpack across portions of the Dakotas, Minnesota, and Wisconsin, which will play a role in the spring flooding potential across the upper Mississippi basin this year. And Mike at North Central River Forecast Center will discuss this more in depth here shortly. On the opposite end of the spectrum, there's virtually no snow water content across the Appalachians, Ohio River Basin, and the Arkansas Red Basin. So snow and ice are not going to play a role in the spring flooding this year across those regions. And then comparing the current snow water equivalent, shown here, to the snow water equivalent from 2 weeks ago, shown here. We can see that the SWE totals have increased across the eastern Dakotas, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, from those darker purple shades shown 2 weeks ago here to the lighter purple shades shown here, which are currently in place, showing that increased snow water content in the snowpack. And so with this additional water in the snowpack across the upper Mississippi Basin, there's a bit of concern with respect to the potential melt and runoff this spring across that region. So changing gears a little bit and looking forward to the next week of precipitation, really the biggest story is going to be the 2 periods of rain expected for the lower Mississippi River Basin through this weekend, where there could be areas of up to 2 inches of rain expected. Some of this region is a bit vulnerable to new flooding impacts, so this could locally increase the overall flood threat in those areas. And then across the upper Missouri and upper Mississippi basins, periods of snow and mixed precipitation are expected over the next week, which will add to the snowpack across those areas. All right, so now we've made it to the long-range portion of the overview. We'll bring into context all the past and ongoing hydrologic conditions and how the future temperatures and precipitation across the greater Mississippi River Basin may or may not produce flooding impacts heading into the spring. So here we're looking at the Climate Prediction Center 8 to 14-day precipitation outlook, where above normal precipitation is favored across the southern half of the greater Mississippi Basin, which could maintain the spring flood threat down through that region. Now taking a look at the Climate Prediction Center 8 to 14-day temperature outlook, below normal temperatures are favored across much of the greater Mississippi Basin, which may preclude the potential for a significant warm-up and rapid snowmelt at least through the 3rd week of March. And if we look even further out through March and into April and May at the Climate Prediction Center seasonal precipitation outlook, above normal precipitation is favored for the middle Mississippi Basin through the Ohio River Basin and then into the Great Lakes region. However, confidence on the seasonal outlooks is currently a little bit lower than normal, and these maps will be updated next week on the Climate Prediction Center's website, and those will reflect the latest thinking for the latest 3-month outlook. And of course, this will be important to watch how this plays out, as flooding potential in many locations across the greater Mississippi Basin is driven by the convective weather, which is pretty typical in the springtime. And now for that same time period, but looking at the Climate Prediction Center seasonal temperature outlook, above normal temperatures are still favored across the lower portions of the greater Mississippi Basin, and below normal temperatures are favored for the upper Missouri Basin. But we did want to point out that according to the Climate Prediction Center, La Nina has ended as of today, and there is higher than normal uncertainty and lower confidence in the seasonal temperature and precipitation outlooks. So just keep that in mind heading forward. All right, we wanted to briefly shift focus to the Great Lakes region and provide an update on the Great Lakes water levels, which are running slightly above average and close to the 2022 levels, but we are not expecting significant impacts, with the lake levels forecast to remain up to about a foot above average through this spring. And to summarize all these ingredients we've discussed here and see what this means in terms of actual river flooding, we can look at the long-range river flood risk outlook valid through late May, where confidence for major flooding is increasing along the main stem Mississippi River from the Twin Cities, Minnesota, down to Keokuk, Iowa, and then moderate flooding is possible on the main stem Mississippi River from Keokuk, Iowa, down to St. Louis, Missouri. And then across Minnesota and northwest Wisconsin into the UP of Michigan, moderate flooding is also possible. In the Arkansas and southern Missouri, flood risk has increased to above normal due to the recent wet conditions there. And then elsewhere across the greater Mississippi River Basin, we're expecting more normal spring flood conditions through this spring. And now I'll pass it to Jim Knoll at the Ohio Basin River Forecast Center for more details on that region.
All right, thank you, Joe, and good afternoon, everyone. The good news is not much has changed in the Ohio River Valley over the last month on these webinars that we've been talking about. We really are expecting pretty much a normal risk for flooding in the Ohio and Cumberland Valley regions, as well as into the Lake Erie drainage areas. Again, minor flooding to maybe isolated moderate flooding is what we're expecting, and that is what we classify as normal. And there's at least a 50% chance of that. And that area is primarily focused in northwest Ohio, down into Indiana and southeast and east central Illinois. That would include the Maumee River Basin of northwest Ohio and northeast Indiana, the Wabash and White Basins across Indiana and on into southeastern Illinois. Also, we're expecting some minor flooding down into portions of the Green River Basin. And then further east in the eastern Ohio Valley, kind of just some scattered minor flooding here and there, depending on exactly where the rainfall pattern tracks over the next couple of months. Moving on to the next slide. This is really what's possible. The first slide we looked at was really what we're expecting. This is more of what is possible. This includes more of the uncertainty in those rainfall patterns. And we are expecting the possibility at least a 25% chance of some minor to moderate flooding across that area of northwest Ohio down into Indiana and east central southeast Illinois. That is our kind of primary threat area that was showing up on the Climate Prediction Center's rainfall outlook as well. Further east, we are expecting the possibility of some scattered minor to moderate flooding across Ohio, West Virginia, and down into Kentucky, and even down into middle Tennessee. So again, for the most part for the Ohio Valley, it's just looking a lot of normal conditions with some flooding expected, but we don't see any signal of real significant floods at this time. And finally, on our last slide, looking at the next couple of weeks, as Joe was showing, we are expecting a little bit cooler pattern with more normal type precipitation for the Ohio Valley as a whole. Most of these orange squares on here are ongoing flooding. We don't really see much new flooding over the next 10 days. It's probably going to be more into April before we see more widespread minor to isolated moderate flooding for the Ohio Valley. So things will be calming down here for the month of March, and then it'll probably be getting more revved up again in the Ohio Basin as we move into April. But again, near normal flood risk with some minor to moderate floods possible for the Ohio Valley. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Mike up at the North Central River Forecast Center, where it's a bit more active.
Thanks, Jim. Taking a look at the area covered by the North Central River Forecast Center, we have had a parade of weather systems really move through our area over the last month, each one adding more snow and rain to the landscape here. And the overall water content of the snow on the ground has increased across our area over the last few weeks, and we're going to talk about that more here in a moment. So as a result, the overall flood risk has increased since our last outlook, especially along the main stem Mississippi River. The additional water that's been added across areas from eastern North Dakota through Minnesota into northern Wisconsin, that's all helping to bring the flood risk higher in those areas. And it now appears pretty likely that there's going to be some flooding along the Mississippi River, all the way from the Twin Cities area, all the way down to around the St. Louis area. And the way it looks right now, it's even possible that from around the Twin Cities down to about Keokuk, Iowa, which is like the southeastern tip of Iowa there, flooding could possibly reach the major category in that area. In addition to an above average risk for flooding in Minnesota, Northwest Wisconsin, and even into the UP of Michigan, the Red River, the North Basin, has now trended upward toward an above normal risk as well. Some minor to moderate level flooding looks like it's a good possibility there, and perhaps even a few spots could reach the major level. Elsewhere across our outlook area, we continue to classify our risk for spring flooding to be about normal overall. So in those above normal risk areas we talked about, minor flooding is pretty high probability. Flooding into the moderate and maybe even major categories is possible, as I said. But for the remainder of the service area where the risk is more normal, the locations that do get any flooding this spring, we would expect that to be only of the minor category. So looking at this plot here, you can see in the red and purple icons there, they're focused mainly along the Mississippi River, and that's where the greater than 50% likelihood for reaching a moderate or major flood level is. And there's also a smattering of red and purple icons up in the Red River Basin as well. And there's just a lot of water on the landscape up here, and especially in those headwater areas. When that all melts, it could result in some significant flooding. The key to the flooding this spring is really going to rely on temperature trends and if we get any more precipitation. As Joe showed a little bit earlier, there is an overall trend for below normal temperatures for the rest of March and a lean toward above normal precipitation. So the cool temperatures can be good. That would allow for some daytime melting, allow a little of that water to be released and sent on downstream, and then everything will freeze up again overnight. That would be an ideal scenario to slowly get rid of our snowpack. But the problem is, the longer we hold on to snow on the landscape, the greater the chance that we're eventually going to see a big warm up into the 50s and 60s, and that's pretty likely when we get into April. That could really melt things quickly, and if we throw thunderstorms on top of that, we could have a big problem. So this is something we're really watching out for this year. So let's go to the next slide and take a look at the water content. And as you can see here, we have snow water equivalent ranking as we've had in our modeling system as of Monday. So you can see we do have an above normal amount of snowpack from North Dakota and Minnesota into Wisconsin. The snow water content generally between 3 and 5 inches for most of that area. Some areas up to 6 or 8 inches. And up around Lake Superior, we actually have as much as 10 inches of water equivalent in the snowpack there. So this snow water continues to be in the top 10 or 20% of our historical record. And that's shown by the darker blue shades there. In contrast, further to the south, we see the yellows and oranges and even the gray colors. And that snow water content is well below normal for this time of year. Of course, this was a snapshot taken on Monday, and we have another system moving through the area this week, and we're going to add more snow and more water to the landscape. So you can easily see now where the higher water amounts are, and when that snow does melt and runs down and concentrates into the main stem Mississippi River, you can see now where that higher flood risk is coming from. So let's move to the last image, and I wanted to show you graphically just how the flood risk has changed over the past month. Thanks to all that additional water that we've added, both rain and snow, look at how the line of black triangles, that's our conditional simulation based on current conditions, that has shifted even further up and to the left. And you can see that in the image on the left side. It's now much higher than the blue dots, and the blue dots indicate our historical average. You can really see the big change from the first outlook shown on the right. These graphics are for the Mississippi River at La Crosse, Wisconsin. You can see how that changes from the right to the image on the left, which is current. We went from about a 42% probability to reach the moderate flood level in our early February outlook to nearly a sure thing at about 97% for this most recent outlook. This shift toward higher probabilities is very similar for most locations across Minnesota and into northern Wisconsin, and then right on down the Mississippi River itself. Again, the key to any eventual flooding is going to be how this significant snowpack melts, fast or slow, and if we add any rain or thunderstorms on top of it. Right now, it appears that there will at least be some sort of flooding for parts of our area. And with that, I'll end and pass it off to Kevin Lau at the Missouri Basin River Forecast Center.
Thank you, Michael. And good afternoon, everyone. I'll start off by saying that our story has changed a little bit as well. Not as bad as North Central story, but we've increased flood risk as well. I'd like to start off by saying that the flood risk for the Missouri Basin varies across the watershed. For much of the basin, there still remains a reduced flood risk due to the ongoing drought. As I've stated in the past webinars, the previous 3 water years 20, 21, and 22, were the 10th driest 3-year period on record in 125 years of record keeping. The drought monitor that was released this morning indicates that 54% of the basin remains in some classification of drought. But with that said, a near average to perhaps a bit above average mountain snowpack, coupled with a significant plains snowpack, has resulted in a near normal to even an above normal flood risk in pockets of the mountainous west and northern plains. As this graphic shows, we are expecting minor to moderate level flooding within several of the watersheds comprising the Missouri River Basin this year. These rivers include the Cannonball and Apple Creek in North Dakota. Beaver Creek and the James River in North Dakota also bear watching as well. The James, Vermilion, White, and the upper reach of the Big Sioux Rivers in South Dakota, as well as the Snake and Turtle Creeks in that state, are outlooked to flood. The North Platte River in Wyoming, the upper reach of the Little Sioux in Iowa, the lower reach of the Big Sioux in Iowa, and the Nishnabotna River in Iowa. The Meredithine River and Stranger Creek in eastern Kansas, and the Little Osage River that runs from Kansas into Missouri. In Missouri, we are outlooking the Grand River, Chariton, Crooked, Blackwater, Lamine, Moreau, Big Piney, Marmaton, Sac, South Grand, Tarkio, Platte, and Gasconade rivers. And along with that, the Wakandal, Manitou, Petite Saline, Rubidoux, and Big Creeks are also expected to flood. And I should note that we have had a couple of rounds of flooding already in February here in the state of Missouri, and a third round this past weekend. So the state of Missouri is getting wetted up. The Missouri River itself will experience episodic on again, off again minor flooding from Nebraska City to the mouth. Mountain snowpack is critical for water resources within the Missouri River Basin, accounting for 30 to 35% of the annual runoff. And with our next image, we're going to be looking at the mountain snowpack. And this graphic is courtesy of the Natural Resources Conservation Service. And this graphic shows by sub-basin the snow water equivalent in terms of the 30-year average, percent of average, currently in the mountainous west. Mountain snowpack can be generally categorized as near to slightly above average for this time of year. By this point in the winter, we have normally accumulated about 80% of the seasonal peak snow water equivalent in the mountains. So the picture of how we're going to come out is coming into focus. So what does this average to above average snowpack mean for spring mountain runoff? Well, that's what this graphic attempts to show. This graphic depicts the expected April through September runoff volume from the mountains. Our latest water supply outlook that was released or issued this past Sunday indicates a below average runoff year for the mountainous west, with the exception of the North Platte. And we expect a slightly above average runoff year for the North Platte Basin. But even with this slightly higher than average runoff year for the North Platte, we're only expecting a couple of locations along the North Platte River there in Wyoming to experience minor flooding this spring. As was mentioned earlier in today's briefing, the Northern Plains has quite a bit of plain snowpack, with 2 to 4 inches of snow water in the Milk River Basin, 3 to 5 inches in eastern North Dakota, up to 7 inches. In fact, I saw a couple of reports of 7 or more. And in eastern South Dakota, we have snow water in the 2 to 5 inch range. in northwestern Iowa reporting 2 to 4. All very impressive. This plain snowpack accounts for the flood risk that does exist in the northern plains despite the ongoing drought. A quick word about soil temperatures. Much of the plains region of the Missouri River Basin has either thawed, or if the frost still exists, we believe that the soil is dry enough to still accept infiltration from rain or snowmelt. And also a word about ice jam breakup flooding. River ice remains in the northernmost plains areas and in the mountainous west, but we do believe that there is a low risk for ice jam breakup flooding this season. But as long as we've got ice in the rivers, the risk remains. So to summarize then, spring flood risk across the Missouri Basin is varied, with much of the basin having a reduced risk, but there are some pockets that have an enhanced risk. Thank you. This concludes the Missouri River portion, and I'll pass the mic along to Becky down at the Arkansas Red Basin. Thank you.
Thanks, Kevin. The long-range river flooding risk in ABRFC's area continues to be near normal due to our climatological risk of springtime rain events. We're expecting moderate river flooding on the Neosho River in eastern Oklahoma. This river typically has greater than a 50% chance of flooding every spring. And we're also expecting some minor flooding along isolated locations on the Arkansas River and its various tributaries, including the Fushla-Fav and Petit Jean rivers in Arkansas, the Illinois and Poto rivers in Oklahoma, the Spring River in Missouri, and Slate Creek in Kansas. Minor flooding is also expected on the tributaries to the Red River, including the Muddy Boggy and Deep Red Creeks in Oklahoma. And we are currently experiencing some elevated flows in some of these locations today, but this does not translate to an increase of flooding risk throughout the entire spring. Now, taking a look at our snowpack, the snow water equivalent in the headwaters of the Arkansas River Basin is currently below normal, ranging from near 30% to around 85% of normal. The snow water equivalent for the headwaters of the Canadian River are normal for this time of year, and the snow water equivalent for the headwaters of the Cimarron and Mora rivers, which are tributaries to the Red River, are above normal, currently hovering around 110% of normal. Now, taking a look at our reservoirs, the reservoirs in the Arkansas River Basin system currently have about 93% of their total flood control storage available. 94% of their total flood control storage available, and the Red River Basin has about 88% of its flood control storage available right now. So both basins are still in great shape to hold back any springtime floodwaters. Now I'll turn it over to Jeff Groschel from the Lower Mississippi River Forecast Center to talk about their area.
Okay, thank you, Becky. For the Mississippi River and the lower parts of the Ohio, we're still looking the same as what we've indicated the last two calls that we've had. We're really looking at normal flood risk for the lower parts of the Ohio and the lower parts of the Mississippi River. And that's characterized as really minor flooding with some isolated moderate flooding. We currently have a crest going on in the lower part of the Mississippi right now with crested conditions at Cairo, Illinois, where the Ohio and the Mississippi come together. And we're still expecting areas downstream to continue to rise over the next 2 to 3 weeks as that crest moves its way downstream. But it's pretty seasonable, the levels that we're looking at right now. And that's what we're also anticipating going into spring. The area, though, that we do have above normal is over in the northern parts of Arkansas and the southern parts of Missouri. We've had pretty good rainfall over the last month with some 5 to 10 inch rainfall amounts over this area. And so that area has increased to above normal for flood risk across northern Arkansas and southern Missouri. And then conversely, we do have a change further downstream. From January through the early parts of February, we've had 10 to 20 inches of rain over Louisiana, Mississippi. And so that did cause a lot of flooding problems in those areas, but it's been 3 weeks now since we've had any decent rain in these areas. So those locations in Mississippi and Louisiana now are looking at more normal conditions or normal flooding across that area. And the remainder of our area is also looking at normal flooding. Again, normal flooding for us is really characterized as minor to, in some cases, moderate flooding across the area.
And just like every year, really the frequency, intensity, and extent of rainfall really determines that final outcome for flood risk for this late winter into springtime. With that, I will turn it back over to Joe.
All right, thank you everybody for those informative briefings. If anyone has questions, please go ahead and type them into the question box in the GoToWebinar GUI, and we will address it momentarily. So to summarize the potential impacts for the greater Mississippi River Basin, spring hydrologic outlook for this third and final update, confidence for major flooding is increasing along the main stem Mississippi River from the Twin Cities, Minnesota, down to Keokuk, Iowa, and then moderate flooding is possible on the main stem Mississippi River from Keokuk, Iowa, down to around St. Louis, Missouri. And then across Minnesota, northwest Wisconsin, into the upper peninsula of Michigan, moderate flooding is also possible. And further south in Arkansas and southern Missouri, the flood risk has increased to above normal due to the recent wet conditions there. And then elsewhere across the greater Mississippi River Basin, normal spring flood conditions can be expected. So that concludes our presentation. And as a reminder, there is a feedback form that we'd really appreciate everyone filling out if you have time. And I'll give it just a minute here to see if any questions come in. I see one question came in about this being the last webinar, and why not continue them out further. There are talks about potentially changing this in the future, but for now, this is the last scheduled webinar for this year's update. I see another question coming in about emailing the presentation, so the links on the pages will be active. We are sending out the link to the story map, which will have all of these live links on it, either later this afternoon or by tomorrow morning. And just as a reminder, if you do have feedback on either the presentation itself or the cadence of the webinars, feel free to fill out the feedback form and let us know in there. We would greatly appreciate it. Give it just another second here, see if anything else comes in. All right, I'm not seeing anything else. Thank you for your time and questions, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. The follow-up email will be sent by no later than tomorrow morning with all the information from this webinar. So have a great day, everybody, and thanks for tuning in.